those, quite a lot of columns. You don't want to start by having to select the whole data set. You can literally just pick any cell within the data and then click on Insert and Pivot Table. Okay, so go to the Insert tab and click Pivot Table. And it asks you where the data is. Okay, where is the data that you want to build a pivot table from? And it's actually picked the whole block. So rather than me having to put in there, oh, it's coming from A5 to G1648 on the sheet called sales data, it's detected where my cursor is. It's detected that my cursor is part of this big block of data, and it's put the correct range in there for me. Okay? So, once I've done that, the next thing I do is tell it where the pivot table is going to go. And I get two choices. I could say, put the pivot table on a new worksheet. If I went for that one and clicked OK, it would create a new tab, so create a new sheet here, and it would stick the pivot table on that sheet there. But I actually want to put the pivot table onto the sheet here called pivot 3. If I just cancel that, pivot 3 is actually a totally blank sheet. So I'm going to stick my pivot table, say, here. So I'll go back to my source data, click in a cell, go back to insert, go back to pivot table, have a quick glance at that just to make sure it has picked up the correct range, and then say, well, actually, I want to put the pivot table onto an existing worksheet. Pivot 3 is one of the existing sheets, existing tabs in this file. So I choose existing worksheet. Then, once I've chosen existing worksheet, cursor's flashing in location, I click on pivot 3 and then click on A1. So I have to choose a cell. A common mistake is that people just click on the name of the sheet. They don't select a cell. So once we've done that, I'm going to click on OK. And that gives me what I call a pivot table placeholder. Also, I get this panel on the right hand side, and I get these two extra menu options up here. You only get those menu options, you only get this panel when your cursor is in a pivot table or a pivot table placeholder. As soon as I click away, they've disappeared. All right, so hopefully everyone's okay with that. Just to recap that, you go to your data, you pick a cell, you click insert, you click pivot table. It usually puts the correct range in there, but you can change that if necessary, and then you tell it where you want the pivot table to go, which can either be a new sheet or an existing sheet, and then you just click OK. All right, so go back to pivot 3. As I said, if you've got questions as we go, that is fine. Just please put them in there. That's absolutely fine with me. Anyway, what do I want this pivot table to actually show? So that's the next thing. Once you've decided where the pivot table is going, the next thing is, what do you want the pivot table to display? And I'm going to just go back to the data. What I want to do for this first example is I want to just show the total revenue broken down by customer location. Now when it says customer location, that's actually the store location. I'm not going to change the heading, but this is actually the store location. So this company that sell ice cream, they have about 6 or 8 stores around the US, and they sell their ice cream from those stores. So I want to know the total revenue broken down by stores. So what I do is I drag the heading at customer location and I drop it into that box that says rows here. When I let go, what it does is it goes back to the original data, looks in the customer location column, and it picks up one instance of each item in there, and it puts them as row headings in alphabetical order. Now you can change the order, but that's the default. Let me just zoom in a bit so you can see this properly. Yeah, so there we go. So by dragging the heading customer location into the rows box, it automatically gives you each customer location, each store in this example, one per row. If I make a mistake, if I decide, well, actually, I did want custom location, you can just drag it out. So you can just drag it from here back into here, literally drag it the other way, let go, and it's gone. If I dragged customer location into columns, then what that would do is that would put the store names as column headings. But actually, I want the store names as row headings, like that. So that's what the rows box does, that's what the columns box does. So if I dragged flavour into columns, then that would allow me to create this type of pivot table where we have the, well actually it's the other way around here, isn't it? It's the flavour names as row headings and the store names as column headings. If I wanted that, what I could do there is drag custom location into columns and flavour into rows. So literally it's very flexible, you can drag things around as, you know, that's how you want them, but I'm going to put location back into rows. The values section, that is where you drag column headings to actually generate the numbers. So like on, you know, on this one here, if I wanted to see the total revenue per flavour, or in our case per store, then what I would do is I would drag the total revenue heading into the values box, like that. And it automatically defaults to a sum. So it knows that the total revenue column back in the original data, it knows that that contains numbers, so it will automatically generate a sum for that. You can change that, so if you wanted this to be like an average or something like that, you can do that. All you have to do there is do a right mouse click on any of those numbers and select Summarise Values By and select like average from this list.
Wow.
I actually wanted to show the sum, so I'll just right click, Summarise Values By Sum. So that's how much revenue, how much money has been generated by each store, and the grand totals at the bottom. But I also want to show how many orders there were per store. So we know that this goes down to row 1648. But we also know that the first row of data is row 6. So there's actually not 1,648 rows of data, I think it's 1,643 rows of data. So what I want to see is, I want to see a breakdown of how many orders there were per store. Now, how do I do that? Well, I've got a couple of ways of doing it. I could drag any of the column headings where the data in those columns is numbers, so basically any of those headings, and I could drag and drop that into the values box. I could even drag total revenue in again a second time. You can have these headings in the values box more than once, or I could pick a different one. So for example, I could pick containers, drag that in there, drop it underneath sum of total revenue, and we get sum of containers. So what that is showing us is that is showing us how much ice cream we've sold in terms of quantity, not in terms of dollars. This company that sells ice cream, most of their clients are businesses. You're not, well, you probably wouldn't get an individual person going into this store and buying 23 litres of strawberry ice cream. But you might get a business like a restaurant or a shop ordering large quantities of ice cream, because then they sell their ice cream onto their clients. So if you're wondering why these quantities sold are fairly big, that's why, because this company sells primarily to business. Anyway, what I've done is I've basically added those numbers up, and that tells me how much ice cream we've sold in terms of litres or gallons or whatever it is. I would say litres. Anyway, I didn't actually want a sum. I wanted a count. So what I would do there is I would right mouse click on any of the numbers in column C and choose summarize values by count. And that changes it from a sum to a count. So what we're seeing there is the total number of rows with the grand total at the bottom, which, as you can see, is 1,643. Now I'm going to drag that out, because the other way to do a count is to select one of the columns that doesn't contain numbers. So order ID, order date, flavour, customer location, drag any of those columns into the values section, and it will default to a count. So let me do that. I'm going to pick order ID, so just drag order ID, drop it underneath sum of total revenue, and it doesn't default to a sum. It can't do, because you can't add text entries together. You can't sum text. So it's given us a count, which is what we want. If you want to change those headings, you can do. That's easy enough. So we could just change A1 to say store, just overtype it. We could change B1 to say revenue. We could change C1 to say number of orders. Just literally go in and overtype. You can then align these headings to the right, so they line up with the numbers. If you want to format those as currency, you can do. So just select the cells and then go to the drop down in the numbers section and format those as currency. We could knock off the decimal
That must
places.
not change the original data spot.
Change the
Correct.
colours of the header row. Change the colour of the text.
Yeah, the sales data sheet hasn't changed at all. He's
It's
just
just this
manipulating
one.
this pivot table.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay, and there's a pivot table. So, I don't see any questions, but if anybody has any questions, don't forget you have got access to the Q&A panel and the chat panel. What I'm interested in, actually, and then, you don't have to put anything in there, because I know sometimes people attend these sessions and maybe they're a little bit shy. They don't really want to participate in the chat, and that is absolutely fine. I'm
Don't
not
be
forcing
shy.
anyone to do
Ask
that.
your
Can you see
questions.
it only for
It would be nice for me to maybe
It
get an
only showed
idea
us and him.
of if there's anything specific
Oh, okay.
anybody wants to know about pivot tables. Now, it could well be that you are new to pivot tables,
True.
never used them before, never seen them before, never knew how to create one until about 10 minutes ago. So knowing or asking about something specific might be a difficult question to answer. You don't know what you don't know. And that's fine, totally understandable. We might have people on this session who are maybe a little bit more advanced. They've built a few
Maybe
pivot
it's
tables
not public.
and they've got
think it usually is.
questions about
Everywhere.
certain aspects of pivot tables. Okay, I'm not
See
going
if
to name
anybody
names,
else asks a question.
but somebody's put, I'm going to be totally anonymous unless you put a really nice comment, in which case I might say thank you. Somebody says they use Excel regularly but have never used pivot tables. You've been intimidating them by them. So hopefully now you're not intimidated, certainly
No,
by the
not at all.
basics.
That
So
was
hopefully
really
you
easy.
hit mark with
It
that one.
really was.
So if anyone else has
No,
got any
no,
comments,
no, no.
questions,
Now we gotta see what
it
are the
could
other
be as
options
simple as,
though. We got this
how
part.
do I change the order? I know how to build a pivot table. I built one once, my boss asked me to. I
Calm
watched a
down.
quick YouTube video or somebody showed me. But I need to know how to change the order so that instead of having it A to Z on store, it's high to low on revenue. It could be a simple question like that. So I'll actually show you that one. So if anyone's got a question like that, save
Well-
typing it in the chat. I'll show you. It's actually really easy. You pick the column you want to sort on. So I want to sort on column B. You just right mouse click in any of the cells in column B, and from that menu that pops up, select sort. And then you can say largest to smallest or smallest to largest. So the whole pivot table now is sorted. It's not A to Z anymore on column A, it's high to low on column B.
Okay.
Now, if any of you spotted something that's just happened. Any eagle-eyed people amongst you noticed something that happened.
Did it take?
I did a sort, and something strange has just happened.
Did it only sort column B?
Whilst I'm taking a swig of a
Or
drink,
did it
No,
pull all the data?
anyone noticed? Put it in the chat.
Did.
Maybe not.
is there a filter in A
The
now?
columns shrunk. If I just do an undo, you'll
Oh, no,
notice
that was
that
it.
column A is fairly wide. Column B definitely is pretty wide, and so is column C. Certainly wider than they need to be. Having said that, I do like white space. When I say I like white space, I don't mean, that amount of white space, because, that will be stupid. But certainly, I like my columns in a pivot table to be a little bit wider than the sort of minimum they need to be to display the data. So
That was like
let's
a
say
trick
I have
question. I
my
thought it would be a lot
column C
different than
that
that.
wide, column B so that wide. So I've actually altered the widths of the columns. And then I do something like sorting. So I'm going to do that sort again. I'm going to right mouse click in column B, select sort, and choose largest to smallest. Now yes, it's sorted the pivot table, so I'll give it a thumbs up for that. But it's also shrunk the column widths, which I don't want. Now I won't call it an argument, but I had a discussion about this with a group a few weeks ago. And somebody said to me, this was in the chat, somebody said to me, Mike, I think you're being a little bit OCD. The fact that the column widths are shrunk, does it really matter? Well, maybe not, but it might matter. For example, you might have created a little chart down here, like a pie chart or a bar chart or something, and you might have set the widths of the columns so that the size of the chart is a certain size. And then when the columns shrink, the chart shrinks as well. Or maybe you put a pivot table there, and a pivot table here, and a pivot table here. And you then set the width of the columns deliberately to make sure everything fits nicely on one screen, left to right. And then you sort the pivot tables, and the columns shrink, and suddenly there's a big gap over here. So maybe I am being OCD. You tell me in the chat. Do you think I'm being crazy for getting hung up?
He wants
on,
feedback.
on shrinking
Give him
column
some
widths?
feedback.
Is it just me? I won't take offence if you say it is just me. Don't be shy. Don't be shy about putting stuff in the chat. I won't hold it against you. But anyway,
Can you tell us how to fix
the
it?
point is that I don't think it is just me. There are other people who get annoyed by the column width shrinking. So what I'll do is I'll just make those column widths a little bit wider. Nobody's saying anything in the chat. I don't know if it's like that's good or bad. But I made the column widths a little bit wider. And what I'm going to do is show you how to actually stop the column width shrinking if that does annoy you. If you right mouse click anywhere in the pivot table and select pivot table options. Okay? So somebody says you appreciate the size of the column staying in position. How can we prevent or fix it? And that's exactly what I'm showing you now. Okay, somebody's having a good chuckle.
Oh,
This is what I get.
He's in England. He's got to go halfway around the world.
Okay, so yeah, how do we fix it? Do a right mouse click anywhere in the pivot table, go to pivot table options, and down here there's a tick box that says auto fit column widths on update. And what you do is you literally untick that box. Okay, so right mouse click in the pivot table options, untick auto fit column widths on update, and click OK. And now, if I
Right-click
choose
and
sort this pivot table, so say I want the pivot table back in alphabetical order on store, I just right mouse click in what cell in column A, choose sort, tell it to sort A to Z, The pivot table is resorted, but those 3 column widths A, B and C have not changed.
What?
Okay. So I see a few comments in the chat. I'm guessing those comments are all to do with what I've just been talking about, the column widths. Okay, let me just check in case I missed anything. So somebody likes to have it all nice and tidy. You want it to stay the way you put it. Okay. So you're following along step by step and your columns didn't change. That's an interesting one. Maybe
The default wasn't made?
are you following along on my spreadsheet? Okay, if you're following along on this spreadsheet, maybe the columns had already been set to their auto width. So what I mean by that is this. If you double click, you may know this one because this is a little trick, but it's not just for pivot tables, but it's for anywhere in Excel. If you put your mouse on the line that divides 2 letters up here and double click, what it will do is it will set the width of the column immediately to the left to be as wide as the widest entry. So that is what we call
Give me that
auto-fit.
one.
Auto-fit is the equivalent of double clicking
From
to set
accidentally
the
hitting
width
it.
of the column immediately to the left to be the same as the widest entry. So it could well be the person who put that in the chat that said you're following along on the spreadsheet step by step and your columns didn't change. It could well be that at the time you did a right click sort, your columns were already set to the auto width, in which case you won't see any change. But if your columns, make your columns wider, and then make sure in the pivot table options that box is not ticked, and then change the sort order, and it sorts the pivot table, but the column widths remain fixed. Okay, now it's not just column widths. It's not just sorting that can cause column widths to change. So what I'm going to do now is create another pivot table. Because one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what if I wanted to have another pivot table on the pivot 3 sheet? Okay, what do I do about that? How do I deal with that? If I wanted that to be there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my sales data sheet, click anywhere at all in this data, just pick a cell, go back to insert pivot table, choose existing worksheet, click in location, and with the cursor flashing away in location, click on pivot 3 and click on E1. You could pick any cell. I'm picking E1 and click OK. And then I'm going to drag, what should I do with this one? I'm going to drag customer location into rows, and I'm going to drag total revenue into values. Okay? And then I'm going to leave the column note. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change that to say store. Now, actually, I don't want to see the total revenue per store because I've already got that here. There's no point, replicating this over here. What I actually want to do is I want to show each one of those as a percentage of that. Oh, that sounds scary, doesn't it? If you're not great at maths. So, if I wasn't doing this with a pivot table, I'd have to start doing formulas. I'd have to do like that, divided by that. And then in here, I'd have to do that, divided by that. Because that's how you work out a percentage of something, isn't it? When I say isn't it, I appreciate that some people might not be great at maths. And even something simple like percentages can throw people. So that's absolutely fine. I'm not judging anybody for their lack of sort of knowledge of maths. But yeah, if you want to work out if you want to show each of these as a percentage of the grand total, because it's all very well saying Chicago generated $31,000 of business. They contributed $31,000 to a total of 201,000. Is that good or bad or what? Well, if you expressed that figure as a percentage of that figure, most people would understand what that means. You know, most people understand 90% is better than 5%. They might not know how to create percentages from
So
that
it's just
point
gonna
of
create a
view.
formula in
Most
LNG,
people
you
know
think?
what a percentage means. But anyway,
I think that's
the
the
good
way
news is, if you want to convert
we
a
do
bunch
it.
of numbers
Yeah.
into a percentage without having to do any formulas,
Oh.
you can do.
Okay.
You do a right mouse click on any of the numbers in column F, and you select Show Values
Oh my God.
As. And then you get a whole bunch of options that you can choose from. And I'm going to go for the one that is the top one, not the second one, percent
Okay.
of grand total. So in other words, display each one of these as a percentage of that.
Mm-hmm.
So right click, Show Values As percent of grand total. And there we go.
That really was simple.
They're actually all
No
quite
kidding.
similar. Chicago is just about in the lead by sort of 1%.
That's awesome.
Any comments, any questions on that? For some people that's like a wow.
Yeah.
Really easy to
That's us.
That's us.
but I don't want to create them manually. Alright, now the next thing I want to talk about is, well actually I'm just gonna, somebody says so simple. Yeah, it is. It's pretty simple. It's just getting knowing how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the next thing I'm going to do is create a third pivot table, which I will create over here. I could create it on another sheet, or I could create it over here, or I could create it down here. Yeah, actually, I think I'll create it on another sheet. So I've got the sheet pivot 4, which is totally empty. So this time, I want to create a pivot table that shows a breakdown of revenue, and I'm going to do it for customer location and flavour. So this is going to be an example of this type of pivot table, because the ones that we've done so far have just been row headings. So let's do an example of row headings and column headings. So go back to the data, pick a cell, any cell, insert pivot table. Quick glance at that, that's correct. Where do you want the pivot table? Existing worksheet. Click in location, and then click on pivot 4, I said, didn't I? Pivot 4 and pick a cell. Again, I'm going to pick A1. You have to pick a cell, it doesn't have to be A1, it could be any cell. That's the one I'm going to go for. Click OK. Then drag customer location into rows, drag flavour into columns, drag total revenue into values, and there we go. So now we have the store names as row headings, the flavours as column headings, and other numbers are representing the total revenue for that store flavour combination, along with the grand totals. You don't have to tell it you want grand totals, it does that automatically, like it did with these pivot tables. Created a grand total row, created a grand total row, and it created a grand total row, and it created a grand total column. So those are adding up the row data. Okay, and again, you can format these, you can change the colours, you can change that to say store, you can change that to say flavour, you can change that to say revenue. Now, we then look at this pivot table, and yes, it's showing us total revenue broken down by flavour and store, but we could present that in a different way. So, if I was to drag flavour out of columns, but not to drag it back there, if I was to drag flavour out of columns and drop it into rows underneath customer location, watch what happens. So I'll drag flavour underneath customer location, and now we get a totally different shape to the pivot table. So instead of the flavour names being as column headings, the flavour names are also row headings.
Like it.
But they are children of customer location. So we've got location, and that's the total revenue generated for the Atlanta store. And then below that, slightly indented, we've got the different flavours for the numbers. So those numbers add up to that. Then we've got the total for the Chicago store, and those numbers which relate to those add up to that. So
We're just gonna do a lot of
We still have a
dragging
grand
stuff around till it looks like we want it to look.
and if
Yeah.
you want to close
Seems
those
pretty easy.
sections up, you'll notice that next to each store there's a minus sign. So if you only
They
want to
should
look
use them
at
the same as
information for
subtotals, except for it's
stores
just so much
and not
prettier. I
drill down,
love
as
it.
it were,
I can't believe I've never known
look at the
these before.
detail of the flavours, you can just click the minus signs and then you can click the plus signs to show the
It
detail.
automatically puts those options in there.
Yeah.
There are two values in the same row category. Okay.
What if I then looked at that and said, yeah,
Yeah,
but
but
I
Compare
actually
sales
want,
comparison.
if I
Product
want the
line.
flavour
I mean, it's the
to be
same
a
thing that
parent
we've
and
always been
location
doing
to
using
each child. So at the
subtotals.
moment,
So this is
we've
great.
got parent as
Be
location
faster,
and
wouldn't it?
flavour as
This
child.
will be
I want
faster,
to
yeah.
swap those over.
This is
So
so
I
fast.
can just drag customer
Right, we're
location
using.
and drop it underneath
Okay.
flavour. So instead of customer location being above flavour, just drop it underneath flavour, and
Oh,
the pivot table
set it
adjusts
out.
itself. So now flavour is the parent.
And doesn't go all wonky because you're moving data around and
Mhm.
stuff. It's clean,
have
clean switch.
Yeah.
It's a
Okay, I can
genius.
see a question there, I think. I'm sure you'll get to this. How do you troubleshoot if one of your lines of data has Chicago spelled wrong? Okay, well actually, yeah, that brings us to a good point as well. So, let's say I go
That's
to,
unfortunate.
I'll just go to this one here, and I'll type I can't spell Chicago, which is good in this instance. Okay, so I've typed in go or something like that. That should be Chicago. Now, if I switch back to the pivot table 4 sheet, or actually I have to do pivot table 3 sheet, okay? The pivot tables have not updated because pivot tables need to be manually updated when the underlying data changes. And obviously I've made a change to something in this data. What I'll also do to help illustrate this
So it's not drawing
update
from it
thing
anymore?
I
is
guess not.
I will go
Like
to,
if you look up what
Yeah,
you
let's
like
say
update
this
it.
115
It's
here,
gonna make you update
and
it.
I'll change it to a really big number like 10,000 and go back to
I
pivot
would
3.
have assumed it was.
So
Yeah.
Two.
that is actually now 38,000 because it changed from 115 to 10,000 and it was for Atlanta. So that should actually say 38,000, not 28,000. That still says
No,
235 because that hasn't
9
changed.
pounds just to
And
help
that
those
figure
of us
as
who
well
are-
would be a much larger percentage.
Not
No.
15
And
pounds.
of course,
But
the
it
grand
auto
total will change,
changes.
but nothing's changed.
Okay.
Nothing has updated. Why? Because pivot tables do not automatically update when the underlying data changes. They have to be refreshed. Now, to refresh a pivot table, you've got a few options. You can right mouse click in any cell in the pivot table and you can choose refresh from the menu. you can go up to pivot table analyze and you can click refresh.
I'm gonna do
You can
that.
also click data refresh all.
Oh Lord.
Now personally, I prefer data refresh all. Why?
Okay.
Because as the name suggests, that will go through every pivot table in this file.
Oh, yeah.
Cause my
And
little
in this
brain
file,
can't
I've
remember
got
how many things I
about
changed.
15
Yeah.
pivot
Yeah.
tables across all of these tabs.
It's not a little
So,
brain, he's a big brain.
Data
Aw, thanks.
refresh all will update every pivot table in one hit. Whereas right click refresh, you'd have to go to every pivot table
Yeah.
and do right click
Absolutely,
refresh.
yeah.
So if you don't want to
Data
do right
refresh
click
all.
refresh or pivot
That needs
table
to be written
analyze
down.
refresh 15 times, I suggest you click data refresh all. So if I do that, if I do data refresh all, what it's done now is one, it's updated that. Two, it's updated that. It's also going to have updated, it was that lantern strawberry, I think, that one where I put the 10,000. So if I look for lantern strawberry,
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 there you go.
Atlanta, yeah. So that figure's coming really high,
needs commas.
Right.
okay? And it's also put in the extra entry for the misspelled Chicago. So that hopefully
right.
answers your question. The person that asked what happens if you have something misspelled. It just adds it as an extra entry. So it doesn't say, oh, that must be Chicago. It doesn't go through the list and say, oh, that's CHCIGO. Must be a typo for Chicago. It actually adds it as an extra entry.
Which
But
happens to us
what
a
you
lot
then
with
do is
those
you can then go
product
back to your
lines
data,
or,
go and find the problem,
Help us find
change
these
it to
problems too.
Chicago,
yeah.
and then do data refresh all. And if I go back to here, now it's fixed it. Okay. So hopefully that, you also shared the important refresh feature, yes. Okay. So yeah,
That's probably one
refresh,
that we did
refresh is important. That is really important actually, the refresh.
Yeah,
Because a lot of the time people forget it. Either people don't know about refresh, or they forget to do the refresh, or whatever. But you know, I've come across it so many times where you'll have somebody who's responsible for updating this data. So what I mean is, you know, somebody might be sort of checking this data and saying, that can't be right. We didn't sell, you know, $10,000 worth of ice cream in one transaction. There must be a mistake. So I'm going to change that. So I'm going to go back through the old sales records and just find out what the revenue was for that order. And it turns out it was 115. So I'm going to change that back to 115. And that's it. I'm going to save the file. I'm going to close it down. I'm going to get on with the rest of my day. And then somebody comes along to here and they look at this and they say, wow, yeah, Atlanta store have done really well. $38,000 worth of business so far this year, 18% of the total revenue. We need to give a bonus to the Atlanta sales manager. What they don't realise is that this is old data because the pivot tables haven't been updated. So if you ever make changes to this data, you need to click data refresh all. You don't need to go onto one of the sheets where your pivot tables are. Okay, you can be anywhere. You can be in a blank cell on the same sheet as your data if you want to, and just hit data refresh all. And now you can see that all the pivot tables are updated. Now, 20 years on, and I say 20 years on because it's about 20 years since pivot tables were first added to Excel, but 20 years on, Microsoft have finally recognised the problem of people forgetting to refresh. And on the pivot table analyze tab, there is an auto refresh button.
Oh, which says
However,
that.
you probably don't have that button because that button has not been made available to the general public yet. The version of
Keys.
Excel that I have installed on here is what they call a pre-release version. So I get all the updates usually a month or two before they're released to the general public. But that's because I like to see what Excel have got coming up, or what Microsoft have added to Excel, and I like to have a play around with it. And then I like to make YouTube videos and tell the people, watch my YouTube videos, what exciting things are coming to Excel. And in fact,
Well,
my
they want
next
them to have
video,
those
which is coming
videos
out on
ready for
Sunday,
their
is
launch.
all about the
Or they're gonna have a ton
So
of
people
questions.
have a resource to go to.
Yeah.
If you click in a cell in a pivot table and you click the auto refresh button on the Analyze tab, you can see that button's gone darker, which means that auto refresh is on. If you click it again, it turns it off. When you click it and it's on, it's not just on for this pivot table, it's on for all the pivot tables that are based on this data, which is basically all pivot tables in this file, because all 15 pivot tables in this file are all based on this data. So, for example, if I go and change that to 10,000 and press enter and switch back to one of the sheets with the pivot tables on, that has automatically changed, that has automatically changed. If I go and change that back to 115, that has automatically changed, and so is that. So, I personally don't see any reason not to have auto refresh on. So when auto refresh is on, any changes you make to your data, the pivot tables that are based on that data will automatically update. When that feature will be available to everybody, I have no date, but I would guess it's going to be in the next 2 or 3 months, because that's usually what Microsoft do. They release a feature to people who have signed up for their testing program, if you like, which is what I've done. And then they get feedback from those people if there's any problems with it, and then when everybody's happy, they release it. But I believe it's only available if you've got the latest version of Excel, the 365 version. Okay, I've seen some more questions. So somebody says that looks so much easier than formulas. Yeah, definitely is. That was a handy tip. Percentage of the
So we're not
total.
alone on there.
Why does it put banana all the way to the left? I moved it to the right, but not sure it all lines up right now. I presume you're talking about. Are you talking about these here? Right, okay. I don't know if you've done something then. So if you're saying why does it put banana all the way to the left, I don't know if you've done anything, but let's say I select those cells there and I click it's one of these, I think, the indent button. So if I click that button there, which is decrease indent, you can see every time I click it, it moves the text to the left. If I click that, it moves it to the right. But also, another thing you can do, and I'm guessing this is what you're talking about when you're saying why has the good banana gone to the left. Another thing you can do is you can go up to the design tab. And this is only when you've got a pivot table that looks like this, where you've got the multi-levels in the rows section. But yeah, you can go to the design tab and you can choose report layout. And instead of compact form, which is the default, you can change it to outline form. And you can change it to tabular form. So again, I'd have to see your screen to know exactly what you've done. But I'm guessing you may have clicked one of these buttons, or maybe even click that left align button. Okay? But yeah, that's something that you may have done. Okay, there was another question that somebody asked before, I'm sure I missed. Or maybe it was did somebody ask a question about filtering, just have a quick look through the questions. What's that question about filtering? Whoever asked the question about filtering, can you just put it back in? Oh, right, thank you. Yeah, seems to have disappeared. Right, what's the best way to filter, the box or data filter? Okay, let me explain filtering. So I'm going to jump back to, well actually no, I'm going to jump over to the sheet called filter. All right, so I've got a little pivot table here, and there's a little drop down arrow here in A1. So every pivot table has a drop down arrow in the top left cell. If you click that, that lets you apply filtering. So for example, suppose I am the sales director of the West Coast and I'm only interested in LA and Seattle. So what I do is I click that drop down arrow, I tick select all, and then I tick Seattle and LA and click OK. So if you want to filter based on the data in the first column, which basically is the data that comes from the rows section, then you can click that drop down, you can untick select all and just tick the ones you want to see. And then when we're done, we can either tick select all again, which will put all the ticks back, or we can click clear filter. Either way, that clears the filter. Okay? But what if you wanted to filter based on one of the columns with numbers? So let's say I wanted to filter to only show the stores where the revenue was over 30,000. Again, you click on that little drop down, but you then click on value filters. So any one time you want to filter on one of the columns with numbers, so basically anything from the values section, you click on a value filter. So click the arrow, value filter, and then choose greater than in this example. Show the items where the revenue, so what it does on that drop down is it lists all the column names, and in this case I want the revenue, so show the value, show the items where the revenue is greater than, what did I say, 30,000. And click OK. And then it applies the filter. And then when we're done, we can click the filter button, click value filters, and clear filter. If I go back to the underlying data, if you were to apply the data filter on this source data, it has no effect. So I'm assuming that's what you were talking about when you said what's the best way to filter, the box or data filter. If you went back to the raw data and you did data filter and then you applied a filter on here, so let's say for example just Atlanta, it has absolutely no effect on the pivot tables. So there's no point applying a filter on the raw data because it's not going to have any effect on the pivot tables. Okay, now you've also got this filters box here. Right, so there's a filters box here. So what's that filters box there for? Well, let's say I wanted to filter by flavour. So the problem we've got here is that flavour isn't available on that drop down because flavour isn't in columns, rows or values. So if I drag flavour to the filters box, what it does is it adds a filter up here. Now that looks like it's not part of the pivot table, but actually it is. It's just this blank line makes it look like it's outside the pivot table. But now if I click the drop down in B1 and click say chocolate and click OK, what it's now done is it's showing me the revenue per store and the number of orders per store along with their respective totals, but only where the flavour is chocolate.
Wow.
I know, isn't
Same
that
thing
awesome?
if I choose strawberry
Wow.
and if I choose all.
All in your seat. Which
So
one's
that's the difference between the rows section and, sorry, the filters section and the drop down there.
So
And in
filter by
fact, if you go to the
salesperson.
data menu the filter
Yeah.
button
Now by
is
product
grayed
line
out
or
when you're in
by
a pivot
customer
table.
base
So you
or
can't
group.
actually use the filter button in a pivot table. Okay, we are almost at the end, but I do want to show you quickly how to build a chart. So actually I want to show you two things. So quickly build a chart. Okay, so go to the sheet called chart 1. Building a chart's actually really easy. You just click anywhere at all in the pivot table, click on insert and choose the type of chart that you want. And you've got a chart. Simple as that. Usually the
That
chart
must be
needs
how
tidying
Christine
up,
does it.
like you want to maybe change the colours of the columns or put your own token or title or something like that. Okay, one thing to be aware of is, let's say I wanted to build a chart that showed just the revenue per flavour. So if I highlight the revenues and the flavours and I insert a chart, Excel will ignore the fact that I'd only highlighted that, and it builds a chart from the entire pivot table. So that's just something to be aware of, that when you build a chart from the pivot table, it uses all the columns.
Okay.
And the last thing that I want to show you is what to do when you add more data. Because if I go down to the bottom of this list and I add, say, 2 more rows of data, but I'm not going to sit and type the data. To save time, I'm just going to grab those 2 rows and copy and paste. So now the data goes down to 1650. Even with auto refresh on, and even if you didn't have auto refresh, if you did a manual refresh, data refresh all, it does not include those 2 extra rows. So if you add more data, you have to go to the pivot table and select pivot table analyze, change data source, and change the data source to be, in this case, A5 to G1650. And click OK, and as soon as you do that, it updates the pivot table.
Okay.
All right, we are done. So, one last thing to do. I hope you found that useful.
That was
Very
not hard at
often
all.
people who come on these sessions
It's just learning
say
what
to
the
me,
tools
"Mike,
are
Yeah,
can
what's
you,
there?
what they're
give me
capable
your
of.
email address so I can reach
That's
out to you
there.
if
And now
I've,
playing with it.
if I've got any issues." And I'm more than happy to do that. I'll put it on screen now. It's mike@mthomas.co.uk. But we do have, well, I've basically encouraged questions throughout. There might be a few questions that people ask now. That's absolutely fine. We'll pass back to Stacey to sort of facilitate the Q&A session. But if you do want to reach out to me because you've got a sort of private question that is maybe too difficult to explain on a public webinar, that is absolutely fine. So thank you very much. I hope you found it useful. Stacey, I will pass it on to you.
Participants for cooperating with us. It is time for the Q&A to begin, and we request all who have questions for our speaker to click on the raise hand option, which is the palm-like icon at the bottom of the participants panel to ask your questions verbally or post your questions in the Q&A panel so that a speaker can read it out loud and then answer. For any reason, if you're unable to ask your question using either of the tools I mentioned, please share it with me by chat and I shall pass it on to your speaker to answer it. Meanwhile, we sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will appear on your screen in the polling panel right now. Feedback form has just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it wouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer. The polling will remain open till the end of the session and you can answer it even after the Q&A is over. We would be grateful if you could stay back a little longer and complete this feedback for us.
How do
I
I get
have
them?
just forwarded a few more questions to you on your chat panel.
Okay. Okay, I think most of the questions I answered, the ones that you forwarded on to me, I think I answered as we went along. So yes, I've seen those, Stacey.
Apart from that, I don't see any other questions coming in mind. So before we conclude this
No, nothing from me. As always, I hope people have found this session useful. So, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. We are grateful to all of you for having taken part in this webinar. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email to webinars@complianceforalllearning.com. If any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends might benefit from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format and can be purchased from our website, or you can call us at 1-800-447-9407. We welcome your suggestions and feedback or ideas on how we can improve our webinars. If you would like to suggest a topic on design customers quality training or for on site, we ensure that whatever is the training necessary, it will get our priority. We look forward to having you with us again sometime soon, and thank you for your continued patronage. On behalf of the speaker, Mike Thomas, and the Compliance for All Learning team, I would like to say thank you for participating in this webinar, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Stacey. I'll talk to you again.
Sure, take care, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Pretty sure Stacy's a computer.
I think so.